What scene in a film really messed with your head? In Shrek, when I saw Fiona cause a bird to explode with the sound of her voice. As a kid, that scared me. She didn't explode it. It exploded itself trying to keep up with her. 'Cause that's the important part. And I'm helping. Obviously. Yes, it was exhaling. And somehow gained volume. Cinema sting. What? I thought it was a play on the thing where an opera singer busts a glass with her voice, hahaha. I think both. It's a play on that trope, but it seemed the bird did itself in. Or when they used a frog as a balloon. Curb stomp in American History X. Also the very similar elevator scene in Drive. Something about the sound of skulls being crushed, man. My immediate thought similarly was the fire extinguisher scene in Irreversible. There's something scarring deep in the brain about hearing someone else's deep brain get smooshed. Also, the rest of Irreversible. The damage that movie did to my young brain was irreversible. That underground walkway scene had me on the phone telling my girlfriend to come home right now. Ah yeah, I was way too young to watch that scene. The ending montage in Requiem for a Dream. Pretty relentless after the rest of the movie. Wow, my first gold. Thank you, fellow emotionally scarred moviegoer. My German class was talking about drugs and their portrayal in modern media when we were working with post-war adolescence literature. My favorite quote from my German teacher this semester: "If you ever want to ruin a date, watch Requiem for a Dream. Trust me, I speak from experience." My first date with my wife was to the theater to watch Trainspotting. How we survived that date, I'll never know. We watched Trainspotting in class, that's why my teacher told us this. After watching that movie, I'm almost surprised the two of you even went on a second date. I was watching Trainspotting at the house. During the dead baby scene, my wife walked into the room holding our 3-day-old son. It was not pleasant. The road, where they went into the house and found all the people in basement being kept for meat essentially. I think the sounds of them all being butchered afterwards in the distance as they were escaping was chilling. The pile of bodies and the little girl in the red coat in Schindler's List. The whole movie is in black and white, except for the little girl in the red coat. Years back in school we watched one scene out of a movie, but I couldn't remember the name of that movie. In that scene, two men sit at a diner and one tells about his nightmare about being right there. Talking about a nightmare, he tells that there is a creepy creature behind the building in his dream. So, the other one says, they should look, if it is truly there. And they did. The creature appears and the man dies of the shock and nightmare. This scene hunted me for years. I can't even explain why it was so creepy to me. And then I decided to watch the movie Mulholland Drive and two men started to talk about a nightmare at a diner. It's amazing how many emotions that can be evoked in one David Lynch film. Mulholland Drive goes from horror to drama and all the way back, sprinkled with a few light-hearted moments and more than a few moments that leave the viewer on the verge of tears. No other film will make me feel the way Mulholland Drive did. I've never seen this movie, but it's always interested me. Gonna give it a watch. Interstellar, when they go to the water planet and time is messed up. Such a confusing concept to get my head around. Everyone else is just listing scenes that scared them, but this one really blew my mind. Spoilers: the scene in Harry where the daughter gets her head popped off. I put myself in the brother's shoes so hard it was almost like it was me experiencing that. Since my family and I have our own mental health issues, the obvious trauma from that made me see it as a POV movie through the eyes of a family suffering from severe mental illnesses. That scene to me is where the brother completely snaps and loses his mind, and the mother eventually does too. I didn't see the cultists or the demon as being real, but figments of their imagination through schizophrenic psychosis. I know that's not the movie's intention, but that's just where my head went watching it, and it was pretty disturbing from that point of view. The actor's reaction to that was what was so stunning and realistic to me. He just pauses, keeps driving, and goes to bed. He's so traumatized that he's in denial and can't look at what happened. Seriously. And the shot of his foot just shaking against the brake. I was feeling so much anxiety during that scene and I don't think I took another breath until he drove away. It's like the worst case scenario I've ever been in A1000, but they did a great job of putting the viewer in the moment for sure. The degloving scene in Gerald's Game. I never saw the movie, but reading that part in the book made me actually nauseated. I had to put it down. That's why Here's the King. There was a part in Mr. Merced's that had me like that. That book had such a great hook. I read all the way up to that one scene in 2 days. Then had to put it down for a week. That was a movie I wanted to watch with my ex, but now after reading this, I'm glad we never got around to it. The degloving was definitely disturbing from a reality standpoint. But when the creep came with his glowing red eyes, while the protagonist was still handcuffed to the bed, was scary too. In Jurassic World, a moody but otherwise benign character called Zera is grabbed by a pterosaur, tossed between them in midair, subsequently dunked in water repeatedly, and then eaten alive by a mosasaur. Relative to the tone of the rest of the film, it is a unusually violent and drawn-out death sequence. It's made worse by the fact the character doesn't even deserve that fate, unlike, say, a main villain. I've loved the Jurassic Park series since I was young, but I thought the scene was really troubling and found myself dwelling on it for several days after. Yes, especially since it was a known good person and wasn't just some rando off the street. I thought the same thing. It always bugged me. Yeah, it was really mean-spirited for really no reason in what is an otherwise pretty tame action blockbuster. Zara's death is also pretty much played for comedic effect. In Dead Poets Society, when Neil's parents find him after he shoots himself, their reaction is so raw and well acted, I have to fast forward that part every time I watch the movie. I love Robin Williams films, and I hadn't graduated high school yet when this movie came out. I'd seen Good Morning Vietnam, poignant, but still funny, so I expected similar from DPS. The deafening silence followed by grief was a tough scene for a kid. Then the numb injustice of Williams' character being blamed. Straight up just watched this in English class. The English teacher left the classroom to prevent us from seeing her cry. Everything with the baby in Trainspotting. That's not my number one, but it's pretty close. Saw it the first time, but whenever I've watched Trainspotting since, I just cover my eyes during those scenes. What's your number one? Yeah, I just can't watch it anymore either. I look away for the curb stomp in American History X2. The alien walking in front of the camera at the birthday party on Signs. I watched it when I was like 7, and I screamed so hard, cried and refused to be alone at night for at least a week. I lived on a farm with a cornfield. My life was ruined until high school basically. Vominous children. Vominous. The electric chair scene in The Green Mile. The dry sponge one. I can't even watch that movie because that scene gives me nightmares. I'll probably have a bad dream tonight because I'm thinking about it now and it implants in my brain. This scene was pretty hard to watch. There's a documentary called Dear Zachary, and if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it, you should go watch it without looking it up first because it's fascinating and also very upsetting. One of the saddest, most upsetting stories ever. So many people let that child down. What is the scene about? Any specifics would be big spoilers. Basically, you start to suspect something terrible might happen, and the reveal is a serious gut punch. I was home alone shouting NOOOOO at the screen. Worst part is it's a documentary. Everything really happened. If you want a stronger hint, you start to dread an awful murder-suicide scenario. The scene in Requiem, where the mum was shouting at the people on the TV, as if they were really there in her living room, and getting frustrated when they weren't acknowledging her. This hit home on an unpleasant level. The ending of Ex Machina, where Ava leaves Nathan to die, as she no longer needs him. Ugh, yeah. Something about getting trapped somewhere, and being left to die, and knowing you have no hope just gives me crazy heebie-jeebies. Sinister. The lawnmower tape. Actually, pretty much the whole movie messed with me. Is that the film where they tie tape the fam to lawn chairs and push them into the pool? Because FCK that. My worst fear is dying in a fire. Cue the family BBQ reel. I was paralyzed in fear. The suicide in Hard Candy stuck with me for so long. How about the suicide in Girl Interrupted? The way they shot that scene was unnerving. Almost all the scenes in The Lovely Bones A Kid. Wow, that traumatized me. The book is so much more enthralling, and darker. I honestly couldn't finish the book. Picked it up 3 times, but only got around halfway through. Seeing that guy just living his life without any consequences just really messed with me. It's just so indicative of the real world, though. Evil people do evil things every day and never get caught. Maybe they have someone who suspects them, maybe even the cops, but they never see justice. I read it when I was young, after having seen the movie first. I didn't understand it until I read it when I was a little older and had a better understanding. It's a touching book with a bittersweet ending. It's such a good movie. The part where her sister is in the killer's house and then manages to escape is one of my favorite movie scenes of all time. When the mountain crushed Prince Oberyn's head in Game of Thrones. Violence and gore doesn't usually bother me, but the screams from him and his wife who was watching and then the sound of his skull being crushed really messed with me. I knew it was going to be bad when Oberyn started monologuing. Never monologue. That one was horrible to watch. Another scene that involved the mountain was when he beheaded his own horse in a jousting tournament in season 1, I think. Such a shockingly cruel thing to witness. Sometimes when I'm watching something extremely disturbing I have to remind myself it isn't real, and these 2 instances I had to remember that. Lyssa suckling Robin in goatee. Breastfeeders' biggest supporters kinda stop and say, okay, we admit it. It's not always nurturing, it can be totally a power thing, and sometimes, it is definitely abuse. Okay, happy. And I'm like, I'm just watching a show here. Spoilers goatee the Red Wedding. The moment pregnant Talisa Stark got stabbed in the belly. Never ever had a show or a movie shocked me to the core like this ep has. Dreamed about it for months and the first 3 rewatches I looked away at that moment. Don't hate me, but I kinda love it. Of course they would all have to die for betraying the agreement with Walder Free. No hate, it's fitting, but no less shock. First image of the baby in Era's head. Pretty well any image in Era's head. The woman singing in heaven and stomping on things is my Era's head memory. The scene in The Exorcist where she spider walks down the stairs. I had never been so terrified of a visual in my life when I watched it for the first time, around 9 or 10. To this day I have to look away or go to another room during that scene. I was forced to watch it when I was 9 in my dad's creepy apartment. I couldn't sleep by myself again until I was 12 and I'll never watch that movie again. I can't even look at pictures of the girl. I'm not afraid of any other horror movie lol. It 2017, whenever Georgie gets his arm bitten off by Pennywise. Georgie desperately trying to crawl away while Pennywise's arm is slowly reaching out to him has got to be one of the most unnerving things I've ever seen. Georgie Return and Death made me burst out crying like a baby. That one was pretty bad, but I'd expected it because I had read the book and seen the old miniseries. The part that messed me up was Pennywise mocking Bill in the house. This isn't real enough for ya, Billy. I'm not real enough for you. All the endings of Black Mirror. Hang the DJ episode actually has a pretty happy ending, surprisingly enough. Same with San Junipero. Every bad guy in my nightmares had Colin's voice from Bandersnatch for about 2 weeks. They would all be totally unrelated to the show. They'd be totally different characters, typical nightmare characters or even people I know IRL, and they would all have his voice. The one where the woman kills the deaf-blind baby. I'm surprised no one has mentioned the flying monkeys scene in The Wizard of Oz. Saw it as a child and had nightmares for years. It still disturbs me as an adult. And Bambi's mother dying in the film Bambi really affected my then 3-year-old daughter. For literally months, her play was about dead mothers, or she introduced dead mothers into unrelated storylines. It was my husband who let her watch it, not me. When I watched in the theater as a little girl, my just mum leaned over and said my dad killed D like that. Hostile scene where off screen the guy cuts of the victim's Achilles heels, but it's done off screen and he tell the victim he's free to go and walk off. I was not prepared to see the guy try and walk and see his Achilles burst. This still makes me gag at the thought of it. The hobbling scene from Misery. I still wince every time. Ouch. What made it creepier was Moonlight Sonata playing in the background. On the flip side, it's proof of how effective that film was. The Cell, when JLo is walking through the killer's mind and sees his child abuse memory. I was young when I saw it and had never seen something like that before. I remember feeling so sad at the realization that this actually happens to so many children, and then hatred for any person who could harm a child. The horse really bothered me, of all things. Oldboy original, there were several scenes, especially when the actor cut his own tongue, that was hard to watch. Best tooth removal scene in film history. Wonderful special effects. For some reason as a teenager 40 years ago watched the movie Faces of Death. They beat a live monkey with hammers at a restaurant to eat its brains. Chilled monkey brains. I always wondered if all of that stuff was real. I read somewhere parts were real, but most was staged and fake. One such scene is the monkey brains one. I can't watch Rabbit Proof Fence. I've tried twice. My mum was stolen age 2, and I can't imagine what that is like to live through. Also Event Horizon, no thank you. Bone Tomahawk. Dude gets scalped, then it's shoved in his mouth and spiked into the back of his throat. Then they turn him over and cut him in half lengthwise by hacking in his groin. The scene with the blind women with their legs and arms cut off was also awful.